Act 3, Scene 2. We start this scene with Lady Macbeth alone on the stage, and she's expressing her unhappiness. There isn't an end to her desire for power, but she's insecure and anxious. Macbeth enters looking upset, and she immediately reverts back to that role of counsellor and guider and tries to tell him to stop mulling over the crimes, that, thinking about them is not going to change anything. Macbeth declares that their job is not done. He still spends every waking moment in fear, and at night time he's ravaged by nightmares. He even goes as far as to say he's envious of Duncan, who is now sleeping peacefully in his grave. Lady Macbeth warns him to act cheerfully in front of their guests at the dinner tonight. She tries to comfort him by reminding him that Banquo and Fleance aren't immortal and that they're not going to live forever. And Macbeth responds by telling her that a deed of dreadful note will be done in the night, though he's not going to tell her. He wants her to be innocent of what he's planning. Look out for the language and those key words that we've seen before. This idea of the deed not being done is going to be recurrent throughout this scene. So let's look a little bit more closely at this language here. Lady Macbeth is discussing with a servant whether or not Banquo has left or not. And as he goes out, she laments that naught's had, all's spent, where our desire is got without content. And what she's insinuating here is that they haven't actually gained anything. All of their actions are leading to this state of unhappiness, that although they've achieved what they set out to achieve, they're not happy, and therefore they can't say that they've actually been successful in what they were doing. And as Macbeth comes in, she asks him, why do you keep alone? And this really highlights to us as the audience how isolated she is. She's incredibly lonely, and we're beginning to see that image of her being tormented and haunted by her loneliness. If we remember back to that owl imagery that we've seen previously, where we looked at the biblical allusions and we talked about the fact that the owl is the only one who finds roosting in these desolate places. And she goes on to remind him that things without all remedy should be without regard. And what she's saying here is she's saying that if you can't fix something, if there's no solution, if there's no remedy to it, then we shouldn't dwell on them. We shouldn't think about these things. And then we go on to that iconic line, what's done is done. And we see this even now. It's part of our vernacular. It's part of us, our own dialogue that we will often say, and you'll hear this, and you probably will have heard this before. What's done is done. You can't go back and you can't change it now. You've got to live with the consequences. But Macbeth is consumed by fear. He's haunted by his decisions. And he talks about the fact that they've scorched the snake, not killed it. And in this instance, he's inferring that the snake is Banquo. And he feels that Banquo has been calmed somewhat, that he's been put in his place, and that he's contained for now. But the threat of Banquo is by no means over. The threat is still very real to the Macbeth's crown. And he is going on to talk about the fact that he's spending his night in terrible dreams. He's eating in fear. Both of the waking world and the nighttime world is suffering. He even thinks about the idea of it would be better be with the dead. He would be better off dead than living in this living nightmare. He talks about the torture of his mind and the idea that treason has done its worst. And he can't move on from this situation. At the end of the speech, Lady Macbeth steps back into the role of the pragmatist. She's trying to be assertive and support Macbeth. She says to him to sleek over his rugged looks, to be bright and jovial amongst his guests. And this reminds us of her earlier instructions to him, where she says, look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent beneath it. Or to beguile the time, you must look like the time. But unlike those instances slightly earlier on the play, her language is a lot less figurative, it's more literal. And I think part of that is her own control over the situation breaking down, but also Macbeth is moving beyond that ability to interpret what she's trying to tell him. So we can see in both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth the deterioration in their own state of being. Macbeth then goes on and kind of half agrees with her, and he's still talking about the idea of being unsafe and the fact that his throne and his life really is being threatened. And he then agrees with her and says, our faces must be visards to our hearts, disguising what they are. And he is facing the possibility here that he can't actually hide the extent of his blackened heart. The language, again, we see that echoing of how Shakespeare uses that similar language and the similar ideas. And we've heard him say, false face must hide what the false heart doth know. And here he's talking about hiding what's in his heart. He knows what he needs to do, but he's struggling with the enormity of the situation. And Lady Macbeth then counsels him and says, you must leave this. But he responds and he retorts back with, oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife. His mind is tortured. The physical image of scorpions filling his head and stinging him and poisoning him shows us just how much pain he is in. He then quickly goes on to mention Hecate again. Ear to black Hecate summons. And we've seen her at these crossroads. We've seen her at the points where he has decisions to make, where there is judgment here. And we see her again because he's at this point where he's going ahead with Banquo's murder and he knows that he needs to make a decision, but he's struggling with that. His moral conscience is kind of trying to hold him back. And he warns Lady Macbeth, there shall be done a deed of dreadful note. So he understands that the talk of murdering Fleance is dreadful. The talk of murdering his best friend is absolutely dreadful. And so the last section of this play, we see a bit of a turn of events. Lady Macbeth is actually asking her husband what is to be done. And we've got that echoing phrase, what's done is done. If it were done, then it would be done quickly. And all of these ideas. And the fact that she's asking him what is to be done shows the fact that she is withdrawing. She's unable to counsel her husband anymore. And she's now reverting back and turning to him for guidance. So we've got a little bit of a role reversal. And Macbeth perhaps steps into this void here. He talks about being innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck. Lady Macbeth was once his dearest partner of greatness, and now he's referring to her as Chuck, which is perhaps a condescending term, but it is emphasising her vulnerability. Macbeth is now keeping her in the dark. He's concealing what he's doing. He doesn't want her to know. And it's interesting to think about, why might he not want her to know? Is he embarrassed? Does he think she'll try to convince him not to do it? Is it because he can't bring himself to even think about what it is that he's going to be doing? And he then goes on and says, come stealing night, scarf up the tender eye of pitiful day. And we've seen ideas about this covering light before, when he said, right at the start, stars hide your fires, let not light see my deep and dark desires. We saw Lady Macbeth saying, pull me in the dullest smoke of hell. And now we've got him again saying, come stealing night and scarf up the day, to hide that sunlight, to hide the light. And it's again because he needs to be able to get away with murder. He moves on and talks about how the crow makes wing to the rooky wood. And we have to pause here and look at this in more detail because we know how important birds have been and that imagery of bird. In this instance, it's symbolic of the idea of the crow as that harbinger of death, the black bird spreading the evil and spreading the kind of the poison into the wood that's full of birds. And it's this idea of evil beginning to permeate, it's beginning to take over now. And then the scene ends with these kind of prophetic words that Macbeth speaks, where he says, things bad begun make strong themselves by ill. And he's referencing that decision that he made to kill Duncan, the bad begun, that initial bad decision that he made, the initial regicide. He's not going to be able to get away with it unless by doing other evil deeds to cover it up. And so he's kind of gone so far into this lie, into this evil path, that he can't turn back now. And the only way he can try to get past it is by becoming even more evil and doing more evil things in order to strengthen his position. And just before we go on and look at the consolidation task to really, kind of make sure that you've got this scene nailed down, it's worth just pausing. We've just seen Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's relationship here in dire straits. They've gone from what we could describe as the ultimate power couple. They were in it together, they're partners in greatness, they had this joint ambition. And now they're barely talking. They're keeping themselves separate. Macbeth is isolating himself. He's not communicating with his wife anymore. Lady Macbeth is already showing signs of breaking, and Macbeth is haunted by this fear and paranoia, but they're kind of both clinging on to the little bit of control that they've got left. I just think it's important here to pause for a moment and go back to where do you think they were at their strongest? Where did we see them as this powerful couple? And it's really interesting to look at the language choices and how different they are now, and it forebodes what is to come. And so lastly, let's have a look at the task that you can do to consolidate your knowledge of this scene. We can draw it, create a pictogram featuring Macbeth and Lady Macbeth on the stage having that intimate conversation. Remember to really try and include key quotations that show their state of mind. It might be interesting at this point to have a slightly wider section going around it with perhaps some of the key quotes that we'd seen earlier on. So you've got a point of reference that shows where they are now to how they were at the start of the play. As always, think about how you direct this. How would you have them interact with each other? How would it be different from when you've had them on stage together before? What would you tell them to do? How would you have them communicating to each other? Are they frightened? Are they powerful? How are you going to do that? If you were telling them how to behave on stage with your actors, what would you do? Write it. Again, think that you're Lady Macbeth. How would you feel after this interaction? What are you thinking? What do you think he's planning? When he says be innocent in the knowledge, how does that make you feel? And lastly, analyse it. If you think back to the couple that we've seen in Act 1, Scene 5, when he just received the prophecies and it was our first seeing of them on the stage together, how does this scene compare to that scene? Think about analysing how Shakespeare presents their relationship. This scene is really crucial.